Good evening, mates. Welcome to Historian's Lullaby. Tonight, as the stars shine above your head and the moon offers its secrets of the evening, cozy up with a blanket, a loved one, or both, ease into the crackling of the fire, and dive deep into the history of flight before the Wright brothers flew in 1903. Long before the roar of an engine echoed across the sands of Kitty Hawk, humanity was already dreaming of flight. For centuries, the sky has taunted us, vast, blue, untouchable. It was the ultimate frontier, and from the moment people first saw a bird glide effortlessly overhead, the question became inevitable: could we do the same? The history of aviation didn't begin with the Wright brothers in 1903. It's a far older, stranger, and more daring story. This episode of Historian's Lullaby takes us back into that restless pursuit of the impossible. We'll journey into the late 18th and 19th centuries, a time when ideas of human flight were less about polished aircraft and more about audacious experiments, leaping faith, and sometimes downright bizarre contraptions. Balloonists floated above European cities to gasps of wonder. Engineers scribbled wild sketches of machines with wings, propellers, or flapping arms meant to mimic birds. Some of these pioneers were respected scientists, others were eccentric inventors with a knack for spectacle. All of them shared the same obsession: conquering the skies. The world before the Wright brothers was filled with competing visions. Should we rise into the heavens by gas and fire, like hot air balloonists? Should we glide like hawks across invisible currents of wind? Should we build enormous, bird-like machines that beat their wings against gravity itself? This was the age of experimentation, when theory, courage, and sometimes desperation collided in the workshop and on the launch field. Of course, not every attempt was graceful. Many early experiments ended in crashes, humiliations, or tragedies that drew as much ridicule as admiration. Yet with each failure came a step closer to possibility. The pioneers of pre-Wright aviation created the foundation on which the modern airplane would stand. Their successes and mistakes alike built a library of knowledge about aerodynamics, lift, propulsion, and human daring that would one day allow the Wright brothers to take off into history. In this story, we'll wander through the lives and attempts of balloonists, glider designers, and inventors who risked their reputations, fortunes, and sometimes their lives to challenge gravity. Some will be names you've never heard, others you may vaguely remember from a textbook. But together, they form the forgotten chorus of flight, voices that remind us that history's breakthroughs are rarely sudden. They are built on decades, even centuries, of dreamers pushing against the edge of the sky. So, before we crown the Wright brothers as the undisputed fathers of aviation, let's drift back through the stories of those who dared first, those who flapped, floated, glided, and crashed, each chasing a vision of flight before flight was possible. Our story of human flight begins not in the air, but in myth. From the very beginning, human beings have looked upward. The sky is more than a ceiling, it is a challenge. We gaze at birds tracing invisible paths across the air, and we wonder, why not us? Before there were engineers sketching blueprints or hot air balloons lifting into dawn, there was myth. And among those myths, none has captured our imagination more than the tragic flight of Icarus. The story begins with Daedalus, a man so clever that kings trusted him to make the impossible real. He was the architect of wonders, a craftsman whose mind bent wood, stone, and metal into shapes the world had never seen. His most famous creation was the labyrinth on Crete, built to house the Minotaur, that strange, half-man, half-bull creature born from the union of Pasiphae and the great Cretan bull. Within its winding passages, the Minotaur lurked, and Athens was forced to send youths as tribute to be devoured. But Daedalus was no mere servant to King Minos of Crete. When Minos' daughter, Ariadne, fell in love with the Athenian hero Theseus, it was Daedalus who revealed the secret of the labyrinth, a simple ball of string to help the hero find his way back after slaying the beast. Theseus triumphed, but Daedalus paid the price. Minos suspected his betrayal, and in a rage, imprisoned Daedalus and his young son Icarus. Some say they were locked in a tower overlooking the endless sea. Others claim Minos cast them into the labyrinth itself, condemned to wander the very prison Daedalus had designed. It was from this confinement that Daedalus conceived his most daring invention yet. If Minos controlled the land and the sea, then only the sky remained. No prison wall could stretch that high. Patiently, secretly, Daedalus began to gather what he could, the feathers shed by gulls and seabirds, scraps of cloth unraveled from their meager blankets, leather straps from sandals. With beeswax, he bound the pieces together. Slowly, impossibly, wings began to take shape, 2 pairs, one for himself, and one for his son. At last, the day came when father and son stood at the edge of freedom. The wings were strapped tight to their arms, the wax glistening in the sun. But Daedalus, ever the careful craftsman, issued a warning. Fly the middle path, he urged Icarus. Too low, and the sea spray will weigh down your feathers. Too high, and the sun will melt the wax. Follow me, and we shall be free. For a moment, the plan worked perfectly. They leapt into the sky, and the impossible happened, men flew. The air lifted them, and Crete fell away beneath their wings. The ocean stretched out, endless and sparkling. Freedom sang in their ears. Imagine it, the first rush of wind in the face, the dizzying realization that gravity could be defied. For Daedalus, it was triumph. For Icarus, it was ecstasy. And here is where the myth begins to offer warnings to us. Icarus was young. The thrill of flight overcame him, and he forgot his father's measured wisdom. The world looked so small below, and the heavens so wide above. He climbed higher and higher, chasing the warmth of the sun. He must have felt invincible, a god among mortals. But the higher he rose, the more the sun's heat gnawed at the fragile wax. Soon he felt it softening, dripping down his arms. Feathers loosened, spiraled downward like snowflakes. He beat his arms faster, but the wings were already unraveling. There is a moment in every downfall when the truth becomes undeniable. For Icarus, it came as he felt his wings disintegrate, leaving him flailing with nothing but bare arms. He plummeted, crying out as the sea rushed up to meet him. The waves closed over him, and the boy was gone. His father, helpless, could only watch. Stricken with grief, Daedalus buried him on a nearby island, naming it Icaria, and hung up his wings in the temple of Apollo, swearing never again to tempt the skies. The story of Icarus has echoed for thousands of years, retold in paintings, poems, and psychology textbooks. It has been read as a warning against arrogance, a tale of hubris punished by the gods. To fly too close to the sun has become shorthand for reckless ambition, for chasing dreams so boldly that we ensure our own ruin. And yet, as with all enduring myths, the lessons are not so simple. Yes, Icarus disobeyed his father's advice, and it killed him. But it is equally true that Daedalus warned against flying too low. To skim too close to the sea, to play it safe, was just as dangerous. In other words, the myth cautions us against extremes. Stay balanced, walk, or fly, the middle path. Too much caution, and you will drown. Too much daring, and you will burn. Wisdom lies somewhere in between. But perhaps there is also a more radical lesson. Why does Icarus's flight still capture our imagination, even though it ended in tragedy? Why do we sympathize with him, even admire him, despite his fatal mistake? Because in that brief moment, he experienced something no human had ever known before, the pure, unbounded joy of flight. His fall was spectacular, but his ascent was glorious. Maybe the myth survives because it tells us something about being human. We are not creatures content to stay on the ground. We are dreamers, risk-takers, inventors. Sometimes that hunger to rise higher will burn us, but it also propels us forward. Without Icarus, would there be a Wright Brothers? Without those who risk failure, would there ever be progress? In modern times, we can read the myth as a parable about ambition and humility, but also about the courage to try. In a world where many of us are urged to play it safe, Icarus reminds us that flying too low is just as dangerous as flying too high. Safety can be its own kind of drowning. Comfort can pull us under as surely as the sea. The lesson of Icarus, then, is not simply don't fly too close to the sun. It is fly wisely, but fly. Dream boldly, but with care. Understand the risks and still take to the skies. Because even if the fall is inevitable, the view from above is worth it. And so, the boy with waxen wings still soars in our imagination, reminding us of both our limits and our potential. His feathers may have scattered into the sea, but his story has never fallen. Icarus serves as an early inspiration of humanity's dreams of flight. Let us now leave the world of myth and enter the world of man. For dreams of flight did not crash with Icarus. Picture Milan, Italy, in the late 1400s. The city hums with the sound of commerce and war. armorous hammer at breastplates in smoky forges. Merchants argue prices beneath fluttering banners of silk. Priests intone Latin hymns inside the great Duomo, still unfinished, its spires like jagged fingers clawing at heaven. And in the court of Ludovico Sforza, the Moor, Duke of Milan, genius is currency. Artists, engineers, and dreamers gather here to dazzle the Duke with wonders. Among them, a tall Florentine with restless eyes and ink-stained hands, Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo was not content to paint saints on walls or design fortifications for the battlefield. His mind soared. He wanted to capture movement, to trap the mechanics of life itself in pen and paper. In the dim glow of his studio, cluttered with gears, pulleys, dissected bird wings, and half-finished sketches, he turned his attention upward, to the skies. It is here, in this world of candlelight and imagination, that Leonardo sketched what he called the vitiaria, the aerial screw. On the folios of his now famous Paris manuscript B, he drew a great spiral rising from a wooden platform, as if a seashell had been turned into a flying machine. His notes beside the sketch read, "If this instrument made with a screw be well made, that is to say, made of linen of which the pores are stopped up with starch, and be turned swiftly, the said screw will make it spiral in the air, and it will rise high." The idea was deceptively simple. What if air could be treated like water? Leonardo knew of Archimedes' water screw, a spiral used to lift water from low canals to higher ones. Why not reverse the concept? Why not drive a screw against the air itself, pushing downward, and in doing so, lift a man upward? His drawing shows a massive contraption, more than 15 feet in diameter, its spiral made of stiffened linen stretched over reeds and wire, its base a sturdy circular platform. For men, stationed below, would walk in a circle, cranking the central shaft and spinning the spiral canopy above. With enough speed, Leonardo believed the machine would bite into the air and rise. Now, we know today that the aerial screw would never have flown. The materials were too heavy, the human power too weak, the aerodynamics misunderstood. Modern engineers have smiled at Leonardo's optimism, noting that the device lacked any counter-rotation system. The entire platform would have spun wildly in the opposite direction as soon as the sail began to turn. But that is hindsight. In Leonardo's time, the aerial screw was nothing short of revolutionary, the seed of the helicopter, drawn centuries before the word even existed. Imagine Da Vinci at his table, goose quill in hand, dipping ink into a horn inkwell. His tools are simple, yet the ideas spilling from them are cosmic. Sheets of parchment are covered in mirrored handwriting, his left-handed scrawl running backwards as if meant to be deciphered only by the initiated. Around him, the city pulses with Renaissance contradictions, brutal wars and lavish banquets, starving peasants and gilded courtiers, executions in the square and madrigals sung in candlelit halls. And yet, amid this turbulence, Leonardo dreams of men climbing into the sky. The aerial screw was not alone in his notebooks. It appeared alongside sketches of parachutes, gliders, ornithopters with flapping wings, each an experiment in imagining humanity beyond gravity's grasp. Most were never built, and some historians believe the screw may have been designed for spectacle, perhaps a theatrical device meant to awe the Duke rather than carry real pilots. But what matters is not whether it flew. What matters is that it was imagined. Because the aerial screw was more than an invention, it was a declaration. It said, "The sky is not just for birds and angels. It belongs to us, too." And there lies its enduring lesson. In our world, where dreams are often trimmed by practicality, where every venture is measured by its likelihood of success, Leonardo da Vinci's aerial screw reminds us of the value of impossible ideas. He dared to see beyond his own century, sketching visions that would not take shape until nearly 500 years later, when the first true helicopters rose into the air in the 1940s. The aerial screw is a failure that lives as triumph. It tells us that innovation is not only about what works, it is about what sparks the imagination, even in failure. Sometimes the inventions that never leave the page are the very ones that inspire those who follow to build what does fly. So picture it again, a Florentine dreamer in a Milanese workshop, the ink still wet on his sketch of a giant spiral wing. Outside, the city rattles with horse hooves, church bells, and soldiers' boots. But in the mind of Leonardo da Vinci, a new sound is already whirring, the hum of a machine that spins against the air, lifting human beings higher than they've ever been before. And the human imagination was still not satisfied. Let's now move from 1400s Milan to Paris, 1784. Imagine the city on the cusp of revolution, buzzing with salons, printing presses, and murmurs of change. But on one crisp March day, the crowd gathering on the Champ de Mars wasn't talking about politics. All eyes were fixed upward. In a field that would later hold the Eiffel Tower, a strange contraption billowed against the wind, a hydrogen balloon, gleaming pale and ghostly, tethered to the earth by ropes that strained like the leashes of impatient hounds. At its side stood a wiry man with sharp eyes and a flair for drama, Jean-Pierre Blanchard. The Montgolfier brothers had already stunned Europe just months earlier, launching their hot air balloon at Versailles. Jack Charles had followed with his hydrogen balloon. Yet Blanchard was determined to seize the stage. He was not content to watch others touch the sky, he wanted to live there. And so, on March 2nd, 1784, he climbed into his hydrogen balloon, carrying with him a strange assortment of propulsion devices, wings to flap like a bird, oars to row the very air. To the crowd's delight, and perhaps horror, he nearly lost his balloon to the sword of an enraged aristocrat who had demanded a place aboard. But the ropes held, the balloon lifted, and Blanchard rose. It was, by modern standards, a crude thing. A paper and cloth envelope filled with volatile hydrogen, its silk shimmering faintly in the sun. A wicker gondola swaying beneath. No engine, no rudder, no guarantee. And yet, as Blanchard drifted across the Seine, people cheered as though Prometheus himself had stolen fire again. They were witnessing humanity's first fragile steps into the realm of the birds. Blanchard adopted a Latin motto for his flights, sic iter ad astra, or in English we'd say, thus one goes to the stars. He wasn't just an inventor, he was a showman. His ascents were theater, science, and daredevilry rolled into one. Within months, balloon fever, balloon mania, swept Europe. Dresses puffed like balloons, fans, and teacups bore images of floating globes. The Age of Enlightenment was drunk on air, and Blanchard was its high priest. But his most daring achievement came not in France, but between nations. On January 7, 1785, he and the American physician John Jeffreys lifted off from Dover Castle in a hydrogen balloon bound for France. The English Channel stretched beneath them, cold, unforgiving water that had humbled countless sailors. Crossing it by air was unthinkable. And yet, for 2.5 hours, Blanchard and Jeffreys drifted across, throwing overboard everything they could to stay aloft: ballast, food, even their clothing. They landed in Guines, France, to the cheers of villagers, and were faked as heroes by Louis XVI himself. The king awarded Blanchard a pension. The balloon was hung like a relic in the church at Calais. Humanity had crossed its first international border by air. Blanchard wasn't done. He carried his balloons across Europe, Belgium, Germany, the Netherlands, Poland, astonishing monarchs and peasants alike. He showcased not just flight, but survival. In 1793, when his hydrogen balloon ruptured mid-flight, he saved himself with a parachute, an invention so new that most thought it fantasy. He had tested it first with a dog, watching it float safely down from the sky. But now, forced to use it himself, Blanchard proved that falling from the heavens need not be fatal. In a sense, he had solved the problem that doomed Icarus. The same year, he crossed the Atlantic, not by balloon, but by ship, and introduced his wonders to America. On January 9, 1793, from the prison yard of Walnut Street Jail in Philadelphia, Blanchard ascended before an audience that included President George Washington, as well as future Presidents Adams, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. For nearly 50 minutes he drifted across the countryside, finally landing in New Jersey beneath the Clement Oak. In that moment, the old world and the new were linked not by ships, but by sky. And yet, like Icarus, Blanchard's life was bound to end in the air. In 1808, while performing a balloon demonstration in The Hague, he suffered a heart attack. His balloon crashed. He lingered for months before dying of his injuries in 1809. His widow, Sophie Blanchard, herself a celebrated balloonist, carried on his legacy until she too perished in a fiery balloon accident. The sky gave them fame, but also claimed them both. What do we make of Jean-Pierre Blanchard today? His balloons were ungainly, dangerous, and largely unsteerable. He flapped wings at the air, strapped windmills to gondolas, even tried rowing the sky, but none of it worked. His machines did not conquer the heavens the way airplanes eventually would. And yet, they brought humanity closer. They showed that the sky was not the sole province of gods and myths. There is a strange symmetry here with Icarus. Both men, in their own way, trusted fragile contraptions to lift them into the air. Both thrilled at the freedom of flight. And both met their end because of it. Icarus, undone by wax and sun, Blanchard, by his own failing heart, collapsing in mid-air. Yet where Icarus became a warning, Blanchard became an inspiration. His failures were as important as his successes, for they proved that the air could be touched, crossed, even survived. Perhaps that is why his motto still rings true, sic iter ad astra. Thus one goes to the stars. Not with certainty, not with safety, but with daring. The world remembers Blanchard not because his machines worked perfectly, but because he refused to keep his feet on the ground. Today, when we step onto a jetliner and cross an ocean in hours, or when a helicopter hovers effortlessly above a city street, we are reaping the inheritance of dreamers like Blanchard. His balloons were crude, but they lit the imagination of a century. He floated above revolutions, above borders, above the ordinary, and reminded those below that the sky was no longer a ceiling. It was a path. So when you look up and see the contrail of a plane, or the silent rise of a weather balloon, remember Jean-Pierre Blanchard, the showman who brought the Enlightenment sky a little closer. He was not the first to dream of flight, and not the last to die in its pursuit. But he gave humanity something invaluable, the courage to leave the ground. And if Icarus teaches us that ambition can destroy, Blanchard reminds us that it can also lift us higher. Both stories end in the fall, yes, but between the ground and the sky lies the miracle of flight itself. And that miracle would soon evolve into a new form. By the late 1800s, the age of balloon mania had faded. The bright silk globes that once drifted over Paris and Philadelphia were now spectacles at fairs, charming but hardly revolutionary. Jean-Pierre Blanchard and the Montgolfier brothers had proven that air could carry us, yes. But humanity wanted more than to float helplessly wherever the wind wished. The dream was no longer simply to ascend, but to fly, to command the air the way a ship masters the sea. Enter Octave Chanute. Chanute's story doesn't begin in a laboratory or even a workshop, but in the roaring expansion of America's railroads. Born in Paris in 1832, he came to the United States as a child. While other boys chased marbles through dusty streets, Octave was learning mathematics, angles, and load-bearing stresses. By his 20s, he was already shaping steel and timber into bridges that carried locomotives over gorges and rivers. The Hannibal Bridge across the Missouri, the Chicago Stockyards, the Fort Madison Toll Bridge, his resume was a litany of America's industrial triumphs. But somewhere amid the rails and rivets, a balloon rose over Peoria, Illinois, in 1856, and the sight lodged itself deep in Chanute's mind. If his bridges could carry trains across rivers, why not build a bridge into the air itself? When he retired from engineering in 1883, he carried this obsession into his so-called leisure. But retirement did not mean rest. Chanute applied to aviation the same systematic rigor he had given to bridges. He gathered every scrap of information available, notes from German glider experiments, sketches from British inventors, reports of French tinkerers. He compiled them into articles and then into his masterwork, Progress in Flying Machines, published in 1894, the first truly global survey of human attempts to defy gravity. Where Da Vinci had sketched visions and Blanchard had floated showpieces, Chanute mapped out a science. He was too old to throw himself off sand dunes, but he was wise enough to gather those who would. One of them was Augustus Moore Herring. If Chanute was the sober engineer, Herring was the restless tinkerer. Born in Georgia in 1867 to a wealthy cotton family, Herring had studied in Switzerland and Germany, absorbing the fever of Otto Lilienthal's glider experiments. By his 20s, he was already smashing his own prototypes into the earth. In 1893, his first full-sized glider had bucked him straight into a crash. But failure never deterred him. He built again and again, learning from Lilienthal, sketching monoplanes, filing patents, chasing the elusive dream of controlled flight. It was inevitable that Chanute and Herring would find each other. The seasoned engineer and the impatient flyer made an unlikely pair, but together they forged something remarkable. In 1896, along the sandy ridges of Lake Michigan, near Miller Beach, Indiana, the two men, joined also by William Avery, tested gliders built from spruce, wire, and canvas. The dunes became their laboratory. The wind carried their fragile biplane frames, and the sand softened their inevitable crashes. Curious locals gathered on the shoreline, watching men run headlong into the air with skeletal contraptions strapped to their bodies. It looked absurd. It looked dangerous. And yet, piece by piece, flight was being born. Chanute's genius was to see structure where others saw chaos. He realized that stacking wings, a concept once suggested by Francis Wenham, produced lift without excessive weight. He borrowed the Pratt truss from bridge design, adapting its strut and wire bracing to the sky. The result was the Chanute biplane glider, two wings, one above the other, rigid yet light, strung together with wire as neatly as any bridge he had ever built. It was, quite literally, a bridge of air. The Wright Brothers would later call it the double-decker. They devoured Chanute's progress in flying machines, then wrote to him in 1900, beginning a correspondence that lasted a decade. They built their own gliders on the bones of his designs. In a very real sense, without Chanute's bridges of wood and canvas, there would be no Kitty Hawk. Herring, meanwhile, longed to leap past gliding. He wanted power. He strapped a compressed air engine to a Chanute-style biplane in 1898, hoping to prove that propulsion could turn a glide into true flight. The machine sputtered and gasped, lifting only briefly, if at all. Historians debate whether his attempts count as flights at all. Some say he managed short hops, others dismiss them as failures. What is certain is that the experiments were clumsy and underpowered. His engine ran for only 30 seconds. His glider was nearly impossible to steer. Yet even in failure, Herring's work mattered. He was among the first to insist that wings alone were not enough, that the dream would require motors as well as air currents. Where Chanute offered stability, Herring injected audacity. Together, they represented the two halves of aviation's adolescence: patience and impatience, science and spectacle. Like so many pioneers, Herring's life veered into disputes and lawsuits. He quarreled with Glenn Curtiss, joined companies, left them, sued them, and spent years claiming recognition that never fully came. He died in 1926, paralyzed by strokes, his reputation overshadowed by the Wrights. And yet, his fingerprints are there, in the early motors strapped to flimsy frames, in the stubborn insistence that heavier-than-air craft would not merely glide but truly fly. Chanute's end was gentler but no less poignant. He lived to see the Wright brothers soar at Kitty Hawk in 1903, proof that all his bridges into the air had held. He supported them publicly, though friction grew when the Wrights sought to patent and guard their wing warping system. Chanute believed knowledge should be shared freely for the advancement of all. In his view, flight belonged to humanity, not to lawyers. He died in 1910, still president of the Aero Club of Illinois, still writing letters of encouragement to young aviators. Wilbur Wright himself, despite their quarrels, penned his eulogy. If Blanchard had been a showman and Da Vinci a dreamer, Chanute was a builder, and Herring, the restless youth hammering engines onto gliders, was his foil. Together, they stand as the last great bridge between the balloonists of the Enlightenment and the true aviators of the 20th century. And perhaps here, once again, the shadow of Icarus falls across the story. Chanute, the careful Daedalus of his age, built sturdy wings, calculated stresses, and warned against recklessness. Herring, like Icarus, longed for more, pushing engines onto wings that could barely hold him. He fell, often literally, but without such daring there would be no progress. Together, they remind us that every step toward the sky is both a calculation and a gamble. By the time Octave Chanute and Augustus Herring were hurling their gliders off sand dunes along Lake Michigan, another mind was at work, older, quieter, yet armed with the weight of scientific authority. Where Herring scrambled with engines that sputtered, and Chanute drafted careful bridges of canvas and wood, Professor Samuel Pierpont Langley sat in his observatory, watching the stars and calculating the laws of the universe. He was a man of numbers, a man of sunlight and shadow, a man who measured time itself with a telescope. And yet, for all his grounding in the heavens, Langley would stake his legacy on the same ancient dream, to fly. Langley was born in Roxbury, Boston, in 1834, in the age of steam and railroads. He wasn't the son of privilege, but he had a gift: precision. As a young man, he worked at the Harvard Observatory, then later at the Naval Academy, where his task wasn't mathematics, as his title suggested, but repair. The Academy's observatory was in shambles, equipment broken, walls crumbling, and Langley quietly, methodically, brought it back to life. It was a skill that would define him, taking ruins and making them hum with order. When he arrived in Pittsburgh in 1867 to head the Allegheny Observatory, the situation was much the same. The place was a wreck. Instruments rusted, books missing, no money to fund even candles for night work. But Langley had a knack for finding patrons, and soon Pittsburgh industrialist William Thor became his benefactor. With new equipment, Langley began charting the stars. More importantly, he began charting time. Railroads were roaring across the continent then, but they ran on chaos. Every city kept its own time. Noon in Pittsburgh was not noon in Philadelphia, and train collisions became horrifyingly common. Langley devised the Allegheny time system, a precise standard of hours and minutes, sent along telegraph wires to synchronize clocks across thousands of miles of track. With the stroke of genius and a few thousand miles of copper wire, he made railroads safe, cities punctual, and his observatory solvent. That was Langley's gift, to make the abstract practical. From the rotation of stars, he gave the world time. From the heat of the sun, he invented the bolometer, measuring invisible rays of energy. His observations helped lay the foundation for our understanding of the greenhouse effect. By the 1880s, he was secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, America's crown jewel of science. He was a man who carried authority, a man who could command attention. And with that authority, he turned his eyes from the sun to the sky in a different way. If light could be measured, if time could be standardized, perhaps flight, the dream of Icarus, Da Vinci, and Blanchard, could finally be mastered. Langley began small, with models. In the late 1880s, he built rubber band-powered flyers, crude little things that fluttered like toys. But he was methodical. He constructed a great whirling arm, like a primitive wind tunnel, to test the lift of flat plates. He measured drag, observed angles, noted that higher aspect ratios produced greater lift. He was not guessing, he was quantifying. And then came his steam-powered models, delicate, skeletal machines driven by miniature boilers, engines so light and refined they seemed like jewelry. On May 6, 1896, from a houseboat on the Potomac River, Langley's Aerodrome No. 5 was launched by catapult into the air. To the astonishment of his assistants, it flew, not a hop, not a glide, but true flight, more than half a mile across the river. Later that year, another model flew even farther, 5,000 feet. These were distances 10 times greater than any heavier-than-air craft had ever managed. The dream was no longer fantasy. It was data. It was fact. The United States War Department noticed. In 1898, with the Spanish-American War fresh in memory, they awarded Langley $50,000, a staggering sum, to scale his models into a manned craft. The Smithsonian added $20,000 more. If anyone could deliver a flying machine to America, it would be Samuel Pierpont Langley. He called it the Aerodrome, Air Runner, and it was a marvel of ambition, wire-braced tandem wings, a tail for stability, and most impressively, an engine of 50 horsepower, designed largely by Langley's assistant, Charles Manley. Compared to the Wright brothers' later 12-horsepower motor, Langley's engine was a beast. Manley himself would serve as pilot. But ambition has a way of magnifying flaws. Langley's machine had no true system of control, no way to roll or bank, only a hope that its dihedral wings would keep it level. Worse, his obsession with safety led him to test it over water, relying on a catapult to launch. It was a design meant to impress officials, not to solve the deeper problem of controlling the air. On October 7, 1903, the Aerodrome was rolled onto the Potomac for its first manned flight. Journalists crowded the banks. The catapult fired. The great machine lurched forward and plunged straight into the river, like a handful of mortar, one reporter wrote. Manley emerged soaked but alive. 2 months later, on December 8th, Langley tried again. This time the wings buckled as the craft left the catapult. It crashed once more into the icy water, splintered and humiliated. Manley, miraculously unhurt again, clung to the wreckage. The newspapers howled. Langley's folly, they called it. Congress, furious over wasted funds, declared the project dead. What Langley did not know was that even as his aerodrome sank into the Potomac, 2 brothers in North Carolina were preparing a machine of their own. 9 days after his second crash, on December 17, 1903, the Wright brothers' flyer lifted off at Kitty Hawk. Langley never recovered. He had given the world standard time, solar physics, and some of the most advanced engines of his day, but in flight he became the butt of jokes. The dream he had courted so carefully slipped through his fingers. He died 3 years later, his reputation stained. And yet, history is not so simple. Langley's models did fly farther and longer than any before. His engine work pushed aviation forward. His measurements of lift and drag anticipated modern aerodynamics. Rudyard Kipling, who once visited his workshop, wrote of the old man with the marvel of delicate craftsmanship that flew into the Potomac, and remembered Langley saying, "I shall never live to see it, but you will see the aeroplane established." He was right. He did not live to see it, but we did. Like Icarus, Langley reached too high and fell. Like Da Vinci, he dreamed in spirals and sketches. Like Blanchard, he courted the crowd. Like Chanute, he built bridges, not of steel, but of data. His aerodrome may have crashed, but his model soared. His failures gave space for others to succeed. And so, in the great tapestry of flight before the Wright brothers, Samuel Pierpont Langley is not the fool the headlines mocked. He is the tragic elder of aviation, the astronomer who reached for the sky, the man who measured time and in doing so gave us just enough of it to build our wings. By the dawn of the 20th century, the dream of flight had become a fever. From Parisian showmen to German glider pilots, from Chanute's careful bridges of wood to Langley's aerodrome sinking into the Potomac, humanity stood on the threshold of the sky. But not every attempt came from laboratories or universities. Some rose from sawdust-floored workshops, from prairie towns, and from the hands of men whose inspiration came not from science journals, but from Scripture. One of those men was Burrell Cannon. Cannon was no professor. He was a Texas minister and mechanic, a man of faith and woodcraft. Born in 1848, he grew up in the South, where carpentry was as necessary as prayer. By the turn of the century, he was living in Pittsburgh, Texas, and working as a sawmill foreman. His life was ordinary until he read the Old Testament vision of the prophet Ezekiel. In the book of Ezekiel, the prophet describes a wheel within a wheel, a great chariot of fire borne aloft by 4 living creatures. To Cannon, this was not metaphor or allegory. It was a blueprint. If God had shown Ezekiel the design of a flying machine, why shouldn't a man of faith try to build it? Thus was born the Ezekiel Airship, a craft as strange and wondrous as the vision that inspired it. Cannon convinced local townsfolk and businessmen to invest in his dream. They raised nearly $20,000, an astonishing sum for a small Texas town at the time. With that backing, Cannon and his helpers began building the machine in 1902. Imagine the scene: in a sawmill shop surrounded by the smell of pine and grease, men planed wooden beams and stretched canvas across frames. They weren't working from aerodynamic theory, but from scripture and ingenuity. The airship took shape like something between a windmill and a steamboat, a contraption of gears, wings, and wheels meant to turn heaven's vision into Earth's reality. The Ezekiel airship was powered by a gasoline engine, its propellers driven by a complicated web of shafts and gears. Above the fuselage, 4 enormous paddle wheels rotated like the wings of cherubim, their curved vanes scooping at the air. Its design was bizarre, more a pulpit on wings than a scientific experiment, yet it stood tall and proud, a Texas ark for the sky. The legend goes that sometime in late 1902 or early 1903, before the Wright Brothers' famous flight at Kitty Hawk, Cannon's airship actually left the ground. The story is murky, no photographs were taken, no measurements recorded. But townspeople later swore that one day, with Cannon absent, a few mechanics rolled the machine out, fired up the engine, and let it run. With a roar and a shudder, the Ezekiel airship lifted off, not far, not high, but enough to make witnesses believe that they had seen the future. If true, it would mean that a Texas preacher, guided by Ezekiel's wheels of fire, had flown before the Wrights. But history is cautious. Without proof, the claim remains in the realm of folklore. What we do know is that the machine never achieved a documented, sustained flight. In 1903, as it was being transported to the St. Louis World's Fair, the airship was destroyed in a storm when its wagon overturned. The dream was smashed before it could be tested further. Yet even in failure, Cannon's vision carried weight. He embodied something vital about the spirit of early aviation, the democratization of the dream. Flight was not the sole property of professors or engineers. It belonged to anyone bold enough, or faithful enough, to build wings. The Ezekiel airship has often been compared to Icarus, and not without reason. Like Icarus, Cannon looked to the heavens with unshakable belief. Like Icarus, his wings were fragile, more hope than science. And like Icarus, his story ends with a fall. Yet there is a crucial difference. Icarus flew too close to the sun, undone by his own overconfidence. Cannon, by contrast, was undone by circumstance, a storm, a wreck, a lack of resources. If anything, he was closer to Daedalus, the craftsman working with what he had, trying to turn vision into survival. But what a vision it was! In a century when Langley's models skimmed rivers and Chanute's gliders danced on dunes, Cannon's Ezekiel airship was something else entirely, a flying sermon. It declared that the sky was not just a field for scientists, but a place where faith and imagination could take flight. Modern engineers scoff at its design. The paddle wheels could never have produced sustained lift, the gearing was too complex, the structure too heavy. And yet, there is something undeniably poignant about Cannon's attempt. He was not chasing patents or military contracts. He was chasing prophecy. His machine was not born of equations, but of belief. And belief, however impractical, has always been the first step in flight. Today, in Pittsburgh, Texas, a full-scale replica of the Ezekiel airship stands as a monument. Built decades later, it is a reminder of one man's leap of faith, literal and figurative. Tourists come to see the strange craft with its great whirling wheels, and they hear the tale of how a preacher once tried to follow Ezekiel into the sky. It is both history and legend, fact and folklore, stitched together like canvas over wooden ribs. Placed alongside the Wright Brothers, Langley, Chanute, and Herring, Cannon may seem like an outlier. But his story reveals an important truth: the dream of flight was never confined to laboratories. It stirred in barns, workshops, pulpits, and sawmills. It was as much a folk art as a science, a testament to humanity's refusal to accept gravity as destiny. And so Burrell Cannon takes his place in the great procession of dreamers before Kitty Hawk. He stands beside Da Vinci with his spirals, Blanchard with his balloons, Chanute with his bridges, Langley with his doomed aerodrome. He is part of that long lineage of Icarus figures, each daring to strap wings onto hope. His airship may have been crushed by wind and mud, but the story still rises, buoyed by the sheer audacity of belief. In the end, the Ezekiel airship was less about whether it flew than about what it symbolized, that in a small Texas town, a preacher read the Bible and saw not just prophecy, but engineering. That faith and flight are not so far apart, both requiring the courage to step into the unknown. And that long before powered airplanes filled the skies, the human imagination had already lifted off. Burrell Cannon may never have reached the heavens, but he taught us something the Wrights themselves would later confirm, that to fly, you must first believe that you can. By the time Samuel Langley's Aerodrome collapsed twice into the Potomac and the newspapers christened it Langley's Folly, the dream of flight had scattered far from marble halls and laboratory benches. It ran down factory alleys and tenement stairwells, in the hands of immigrants who worked by day and sodded by night. It lived in men who studied birds in the ship's rigging and learned wind the way a sailor learns prayer. One of those men, quiet, stubborn, and forever between paychecks, was Gustave Whitehead. He was born in Luthershausen, Bavaria, a boy who played at the edge of the fields and watched storks carve slow hieroglyphs in the sky. He built kites, he tethered birds, until the police told him to stop, and earned a nickname that clung to him, the Flyer. Orphaned young, trained as a mechanic, he followed work to Hamburg and then onto a sailing ship where the sea and wind taught him lessons no textbook could: how lift feels in the gut, how pressure shifts, how a gust can turn a canvas from friend to enemy. By the early 1890s he was in the United States tinkering with gliders for the Boston Aeronautical Society, building advertising kites for a toy company, studying what birds did without thinking. He had the hands of a machinist and the patience of a fisherman. Bridgeport, Connecticut, became his workshop and his refuge. The factories there clanked with a music he understood. In narrow rented rooms he bent bamboo ribs, stitched silk, and whittled mahogany propellers into delicate scimitars. Newspapers, Scientific American among them, took notice, printing a photo and short description of his novel flying machine in June of 1901, a folding-wing monoplane with ground wheels and twin air screws, ready for preliminary trials. It was a tease, a postcard from the future. What happened next is the hinge on which Whitehead's legend swings. In the milky light before dawn on August 14, 1901, he and a small cluster of helpers rolled number 21 to a stretch of hard-packed shoreline at Lordship Manor, Fairfield. The wings were lilienthal-shaped, ribbed with bamboo and guyed with wire. A small motor turned twin propellers, another drove the wheels to build speed. According to the Bridgeport Sunday Herald story 4 days later, Whitehead took off, climbed to roughly 50 feet, and flew about half a mile before throttling back to a soft landing. The report even described how he avoided a stand of trees, not with a steering wheel, but with the sailor's instinctive weight shift, the pilot leaning into a bank like a cyclist, and the machine answering. If true, it would mean that an immigrant machinist in Connecticut, 2 years before Kitty Hawk, made a controlled, powered flight. The story was copied in papers from Boston to Washington and then across the Atlantic. And then, like early mist, it thinned. For every witness who swore they saw Whitehead fly, another shrugged or contradicted them. Affidavits gathered decades later painted a pointillist picture, short hops over factory lots, skimming flights low as a hedge, one helper insisting he watched a 1.5 mile arc along the beach. But affidavits age the way memories do. They fade and sharpen in all the unhelpful places. There is no surviving photograph of number 21 in the air, only a line drawing said to be based on a photo that no one has ever produced. The Royal Aeronautical Society, sifting the record, concluded that the available evidence does not support the claim that Whitehead made sustained, controlled, powered flights before the Wrights. Scientific American reached the same judgment a century after its first, hopeful note. And the Smithsonian's official position, after reviewing a century of arguments and counter-arguments, is that the case remains unproven. And yet, step into that August morning for a moment anyway. The horizon is a chalk line. The tide breathes. The little motor shivers the frame. A handful of men hold ropes, shirt sleeves rolled, eyes bright with the dangerous happiness of the unlicensed. If we give Whitehead his legend for the span of a paragraph, we can feel the ground hesitate under number 21, feel the lightness creep into its bones, and watch the craft rise into a world that is suddenly larger than the shoreline. A field becomes a runway, a rumor becomes a possibility. The months that followed were a churn of promise and setback. Whitehead wrote that he improved number 22, added a stronger, 5-cylinder kerosene engine of his own design, and in January 1902 managed 2 flights over Long Island Sound, one of 2 miles, a second of 7 in a big circle back to shore. He promised photographs in spring. None came. Some helpers swore they saw those sound flights, others said they heard of them after the fact. Skeptics pointed out the control problem and the thin power margins, admirers countered with the raw fact of Whitehead's engines and a dozen small demonstrations, towed starts, powered skims, glides that looked like intention more than accident. The record, even at the time, was a palimpsest, overwritten, smudged, rewritten again. This is part of Whitehead's magnetism. He is the prototype of the outsider inventor, brilliant with his hands, careless with money, too busy building to curate a legacy. He sold just enough motors to keep the rent due, he hid tools in a neighbor's cellar when creditors came, he lost an eye in a factory accident, took a blow to the chest that left him with angina, and still kept tinkering. He exhibited a motor at the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904. He sketched helicopters with 60-bladed rotors and watched one lift itself, unmanned, a few inches, the dragonfly dream that would take another 60 years to mature. Lastly, Whitehead was a creature of mornings, up early, chasing a sky most people mistook for a ceiling. Around him, the world argued. In the 1930s, writer Stella Randolph published Lost Flights of Gustave Whitehead and gathered a clutch of sworn statements from neighbors and helpers. Supporters like William O'Dwyer spent decades knocking on doors and turning up photographs of other Whitehead machines on the ground and stories to flight seen from a street corner of hops the length of a vacant lot. Each testimonial felt like a small, warm light. Together they never quite made noon. Historians at the Smithsonian and elsewhere pushed back, affidavits taken decades after the fact, they warned, cannot outweigh the Wrights' contemporaneous documentation, telegrams, journals, photographs, engineering notes, and their repeatable public demonstrations beginning in 1908. The debate slept, then flared again in 2013 when Jane's All the World's Aircraft ran an editorial arguing for Whitehead's priority. The publisher later distanced itself, and technical historians dismantled a key photo to claim. Connecticut, proud of its adopted son, declared a state-powered flight day in Whitehead's honor. Ohio, equally proud of the Dayton brothers, fired back with its own resolution. A century on, the sky over 1901 is still hazy. So what, then, do we do with Gustave Whitehead in a story marching toward Kitty Hawk? We place him where he belongs, right in the middle of the current that carried us from kites and gliders to powered flight. He was there in the culture of 1900, when newspapers turned every rumor into a banner headline, when the frontier mind believed a man with a file and a lathe could change the world, when immigrants poured genius into American industry and took only enough out to keep their children fed. He is a foil to Langley, who had money and institutions and crashed anyway, a cousin to Herring, who kept strapping engines to Hope, a neighbor to Chanute, who believed knowledge should be shared even when it made lawyers frown. And if we listen closely, we can hear the old myth rustling behind him. Icarus fell for flying too high, Daedalus warned him to hold the middle path. Whitehead didn't fall from the sky, he slipped from history. Not because he lied, necessarily, and not because he succeeded. He slipped because he was busy. Because he built and rebuilt and chased new engines when he should have hired a photographer, and because history usually favors the men who bring witnesses and stopwatches. In another life, with a patron and a careful ledger, perhaps he becomes a household name. In this life, he died in 1927 lifting a car engine in his yard, still working, still believing that weight could be taught to float. Here is the sober truth for our age of arguments: whether or not Whitehead made a controlled, powered half-mile flight at dawn in 1901, the world was ready. 9 days after Langley's second crash, the Wrights would prove what repeatability looks like: controlled turns, measured distances, photographs, witnesses, logs. They brought the receipts. But they did not arrive alone. Behind every first is a crowd, men with salt in their hair from ship spray, boys who tied strings to birds until the constable arrived, machinists who could feel a bearings complaint through the pads of their fingers. Gustave Whitehead was one of those men. And so we carry him forward in our story, not as the crowned first, but as the necessary ghost in the machine, the whisper that made other men get up earlier, try harder, and write everything down. We keep his dawns and his engines, his folding wings and stubborn luck. We keep the rumor that once, on a Connecticut beach, the ground let go of him and he waved to his friends. Because even if the proof is forever a little out of focus, the longing is sharp as a propeller blade. And longing, in the end, is what lifts us. The wind in our story has shifted. We've followed the balloonists and glider men, the astronomers and sawmill preachers, the immigrants who rose at dawn to coax contraptions into the air. We've watched rumors of flight ripple across oceans and newspapers, some true, many not. Now the narrative narrows to a single back room in Dayton, Ohio, where two quiet brothers with inky fingers and chain grease under their nails do something radical they refuse to guess. They will not ask the sky for favors. They will measure it, learn its moods, and teach themselves to speak its language. Wilbur and Orville Wright were the bishop's boys, children of a traveling clergyman, Milton Wright, and their mechanically gifted mother, Susan. They grew up in a house crowded with books and arguments, where ideas were passed around at the dinner table like bread. They had no middle names, no diplomas on the wall, and no illusions about the difficulty of their chosen obsession. What they did have was a memory, a toy helicopter their father brought home when they were boys, a fragile thing of cork, paper, bamboo, and a rubber band, based on the ideas of the French pioneer Alphonse Pénaud. They wound it, let it go, watched it climb, and when it broke they built another. It is a small origin myth, but a fitting one. Make, test, watch, revise, again and again until the air says yes. They found their way into flight sideways. Orville started a print shop as a teenager, building his own press. Wilbur joined as editor. They printed everything from a neighborhood weekly to the poems of their friend Paul Laurence Dunbar. Then the bicycle craze swept the country, and the brothers pivoted, opening a little shop to sell, repair, and eventually manufacture their own line of bikes. Bicycles taught them balance and control in their hands and spines, not as abstractions. A bicycle turns by leaning, by trusting instability and mastering it with constant, minute corrections. The lesson would prove decisive. They read about Otto Lilienthal, the bold German who threw himself off hillsides with wings on his shoulders, and about the careful old engineer Octave Chanute who stitched the world's experiments into a single book. They studied Samuel Langley's models and his failures. When Lilienthal died in 1896, falling from the sky he'd courted so devoutly, the brothers felt both the danger and the invitation. They did not rush to bolt an engine to a frame. They came to a different conclusion, one so simple it sounds like a prayer. First, learn to control a craft in the air, then add power. In May of 1899, Wilbur wrote to the Smithsonian asking for everything they had on aeronautics. The letter is polite, almost shy, but the work that followed was not. He studied birds and noticed that they do not steer like boats. They bank, rolling their bodies and changing the angle of their wing tips to carve turns and right themselves when the wind tips them. In the bicycle shop, Wilbur idly twisted an empty inner tube box and watched the opposite corners rise and fall. There was the seed, wing warping, a way to shape the wing itself, raising lift on one side and lowering it on the other, so the machine would roll into a turn like a hawk. They built a kite to test the idea, 5 feet across, cambered wings, control lines to warp the surfaces, and felt, through the string, that the air would listen. The next step required a place with steady wind, soft sand, and privacy from circus-minded reporters. Octave Chanute suggested the mid-Atlantic coast. U.S. Weather Bureau data pointed to a remote strip of the Outer Banks called Kitty Hawk, where the wind came regular and the dunes were kind if you fell. The brothers packed canvas and spruce, a few tools, a tent, and the stubborn belief that careful work could beat luck. In 1900, Wilbur made the first tentative glides while Orville and a few locals held ropes like kite handlers. The elevator, a forward-mounted control surface, worked, the lift did not. No matter. They had a camp, a method, a horizon to test against. The 1901 season nearly broke them. They returned with a larger machine, expecting more lift and longer flights. Instead, the glider was sullen. It produced about a third of the lift their calculations promised. Worse, when Wilbur tried to turn using wing warping alone, the nose sometimes swung the wrong way. After one gloomy day of short, bucking hops, Wilbur muttered to Orville that man might not fly for 1,000 years. But discouragement is not defeat, not for men who can build a printing press from scrap. Back in Dayton they questioned everything they had taken on faith, including the cherished Smeaton coefficient, an old constant used to calculate air pressure on a surface. They invented a tabletop experiment using a whirling bicycle wheel to compare lift and drag. The results punched holes in tradition. Then, behind the bike shop, they built a 6-foot wind tunnel, pine, tin, a fan, and balances they improvised from spokes and hacksaw blades, and ran systematic tests on hundreds of model wings. Through a little window in the tunnel's roof, they watched miniature airfoils find their stride, and they wrote their own tables of lift and drag. The data told a new story. Longer, narrower wings offered a better lift-to-drag balance. The accepted pressure coefficient was wrong. Lilienthal's numbers were right for the shapes he had tested, but the brothers needed to trust their own measurements. When they returned to the Outer Banks in 1902, they brought the most valuable cargo a flyer can carry: understanding. The new glider had longer, slimmer wings with gentler camber. It also had a vertical tail, at first fixed, then, after frightening spirals and sideways slides, made movable and linked to the wing-warping cradle so that a single motion would simultaneously roll the machine and yaw the nose the right way. In that moment, they discovered the true purpose of the rudder in the air, not to steer like a ship, but to aim, coordinating with roll to tame the yaw that turning creates. By early October they were carving graceful S-curves along the dunes, stringing flight after flight into hours of experience. On October 9th, they achieved something no one else had: true, repeatable control in roll, pitch, and yaw. 3-axis control, the grammar of the airplane, was born in the wind and sand of Kill Devil Hills. Power now became a practical question, not a fantasy. Could a lightweight engine deliver enough thrust to overcome drag? Could propellers be efficient enough? They wrote to engine makers and got back shrugs. So they asked a trusted colleague, Charlie Taylor, their shop mechanic, to build one. Working from scratch in the bicycle shop, Taylor cast an aluminum block and assembled a simple 12-horsepower engine that weighed about 180 pounds. For propellers, the brothers discovered that no one could tell them what shape would be best. There were tables for boat screws, but an airplane propeller is a different creature, a rotating wing. So they ran more wind tunnel tests, did the math, argued late into the night, and carved their own 8-foot blades from laminated spruce. The finished pair, counter-rotating to cancel torque, were remarkably efficient, not because of magic but because they understood that each section of the blade should meet the air at the right angle and speed, the way a wing does. They called the machine the Flyer. Spruce spars, muslin skin, a framework braced with wires in a modified truss they'd admired in Chanute's work, a forward elevator to catch pitch before it could become a dive, drooping wings that traded inherent stability for responsiveness, a pilot lying prone to reduce drag and work the hip cradle that warped the wings and moved the rudder. It was wildly unlike anything that rolled or sailed. It was built to be flown, not sat in. December 1903 at Kill Devil Hills was upset by wind and cold and long delays. A prop shaft cracked. They machined replacements back in Dayton and returned. On December 14th, Wilbur won a coin toss, tried to fly, and stalled almost immediately, crunching the front elevator. They repaired what they could, waited for a better day, and on December 17th, with a 27-mile-per-hour headwind freezing their faces, they set the flyer on a 60-foot launching rail. Orville took the first turn. He eased the engine, the propellers bit, the flyer slid, wobbled up, then fell back 120 feet in 12 seconds, barely 10 feet above the sand, but it flew. 3 more flights followed, each a little longer, the last carrying Wilbur 852 feet in 59 seconds before a gust flipped the craft and battered it beyond further use. 5 people saw it. 1. John T. Daniels of the life-saving station snapped the photograph that would change how we tell the story of the 20th century. They sent a telegram home, politely asked their father to notify the press, and were largely ignored. One paper distorted the facts into fiction, others shrugged. The brothers didn't mind. Publicity without protection meant competitors. They went home, fixed the flyer, studied what the wind had taught them, and focused on turning their proof into something practical. In 1904 and 1905 at Huffman Prairie, a cow pasture outside Dayton, they built new flyers and quietly turned the world inside out. Lighter winds made takeoffs tricky, so they devised a simple catapult, a falling weight and a frame, to yank the flyer along its rail to flying speed. They tinkered with balance and tail moments, enlarged and moved the elevator and rudder farther from the wings, separated the controls so each axis could be trimmed on its own, and learned how to fly in circles, then figure eights, then for minutes at a time. On September 20th, 1904, Wilbur completed the first full circle ever flown in a powered, heavier-than-air machine. By October 1905, the Flyer 3 was staying aloft for half an hour and covering scores of laps over the pasture. A few invited friends and their father watched the long flights. The local press did not. The Wrights were content with that. Their attorney urged secrecy until the patent was secure. Competitors lurked. The U.S. Army had recently sunk $50,000 into Langley's failures and wasn't eager to be persuaded by 2 bicycle makers from Ohio. Secrecy made business sense but muddied their reputation. European experimenters, Santos Dumont in Paris, Farman and Delagrange in France, flew publicly and became celebrities. The Wrights declined demonstrations without contracts. Many in Washington and abroad began to mutter that the alleged experiments in Ohio were tall tales. The brothers ignored the chatter and wrote careful letters to governments in the US, Britain, France, and Germany offering a machine of practical utility. "Show us," the officials replied. "Sign first," the brothers insisted. It was a stalemate until 1908, when contracts finally brought them into the open, Orville to Fort Myer, Virginia, Wilbur to the racecourse at Le Mans, where their controlled banking turns, long, exact flights, and calm mastery stunned huge crowds and silenced doubters. But that step lies just beyond the title of our story. Because our project is Flight Before the Wright Brothers, the temptation is to end the tale standing on the sand at Kitty Hawk, eyes full of tears and wind, watching a fragile machine skim 10 feet above the ground. But the real culmination is not a photograph or a number. It is the shape of the brothers' method, the new posture they taught humanity to take toward the sky. Remember where we began, in myth and spectacle. Icarus built from wax and warning, Da Vinci sketched a spiral wing and dreamed in candlelight, Blanchard drifted over the channel in a silk lantern, Chanute built a bridge of air with struts and wires, Herring strapped engines to hope, Langley's models flew further than anyone's, then his great aerodrome slapped the Potomac like a skipping stone, Burrell cannon read Ezekiel and carved for paddle wheels for the sky. Gustave Whitehead may or may not have risen at dawn and waved to his friends. These are necessary chapters. They supplied courage, shapes, engines, data, and, most of all, questions. But the Wrights brought something rarer, closure to the puzzle. They found the missing grammar, control, and then wrote their own dictionary in a wind tunnel. They learned through repetition, not revelation. They balanced like cyclists in a crosswind. They made the airplane not a stunt, nor a sermon, but a skill. There is poetry in their austerity. While others sought inherent stability, the Wrights chose responsive instability, believing a pilot could and should command every axis. While others treated the rudder like a ship's wheel, they made it a partner to roll. While others chased bigger engines and bigger boasts, they asked whether the numbers added up, is there enough thrust to beat our measured drag? Can our propeller sections meet the air like wings? Their answers were hand-carved and hand-tested, yes, but they were also precise. That's the legacy, the way of thinking, the experimental loop that every pilot and engineer recognizes today. There is also tenderness in the way they worked. They protected each other. Wilbur likely made most of the early glides to spare Orville and their father worry. They kept their circle small, 2 brothers, 1 mechanic, a handful of lifesavers, a few farmers on a fence. They were not saints. Later, they would defend their patents fiercely, and quarrels with old friends like Chanute would sting, but they were resolutely serious in an age of spectacular claims. When we set the Wrights amid the chorus that came before them, the story resolves into harmony. Daedalus teaches craft, Icarus warns about the appetite for altitude. Da Vinci teaches imagination, Blanchard, showmanship and nerve, Chanute, structure and community, Herring, restless propulsion, Langley, the dignity and danger of institutional ambition, Cannon, the moral force of belief, Whitehead, the stubborn hope of outsiders and the need for records. The Wrights absorb all of that, and then they add the piece that finally lifts us clear, an airplane that can be learned, repeated, and handed from one pilot to the next. And that is perhaps the best way to end. Not with a single first, but with a bridge. On December 17, 1903, when the flyer knifed into the wind and left 2 parallel ruts in the sand, it did so with centuries of stories wrapped into its ribs. The bishop's boys carried a toy helicopter and a library of arguments. They carried Lilienthal's fall and Chanute's letters, Langley's sums, and the memory of balloons rising at Versailles. They carried whispers from barns and shipyards, from Paris salons and Texas sawmills, from German hillsides and Connecticut beaches. They lifted them all, briefly and then at length, until the problem of flight became a craft rather than a miracle. Stand with them one last time on that cold ridge. The flyer sits on its rail, muslin snapping, propellers flicking the air into two clean spirals. The pilot lies prone, one hand on a lever, hips cradled in a wooden stirrup, mind quiet and alert. There is no promise of success, only the next experiment. The weight falls, the machine slides, and for a long instant the Earth lets go. This is the end of flight before the Wright Brothers, and the beginning of everything after. Thank you for tuning in to Historian's Lullaby. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. And until we meet again, good night.